Hello, I'm Amanda Walker, and welcome to Inside America, the show that brings you insight and analysis of the biggest issues facing America right now. This week, riding the real or imagined crime wave. Politicians have been doing it for decades. The polls say it's a big issue for voters, but does the data match public perception that crime is rising? It's also a key theme in the 2024 matchup. Democrats are pitting their candidate, Kamala Harris, as the prosecutor-in-chief, taking on Donald Trump, the convicted felon.
In the courtroom, I stood proudly before a judge, and I said 5 words: Kamala Harris for the people.
While Donald Trump is busy convincing voters that America has never been more dangerous.
But you can't walk across the street to get a loaf of bread. You get shot, you get mugged, you get raped, you get whatever it may be.
Coming up, we meet community leaders in Baltimore who are taking the fight against crime into their own hands.
That corner right there was one of the most violent corners in America.
And we explore the gap between the perception of crime and the reality on the ground.
Unfortunately, in America, crime and criminal justice policy have been extremely politicized.
Now, the city of Baltimore, Maryland, has a bad reputation when it comes to crime. According to one recent survey, it has the highest per capita levels of murder and robbery among larger cities. Donald Trump once called it a rodent-infested mess, which provoked real anger from those who call the city home. We went there to meet some of the people doing everything in their power to turn things around.
Out of about 30 houses, only about 12 of them are lived in.
Pastor Derek DeWitt is giving me a tour of his neighborhood, Sandtown Winchester in Baltimore, so called because of the local quarry sand that blew onto its once polished, now abandoned marble doorsteps. Like so many places, when industries died, drugs took hold, snuffing out hope and igniting crime.
The rec center's closed and the school's closed.
So what are the kids supposed to do that still live here?
Smoke weed and make babies and crime. That corner right there was one of the most violent corners in America. About 23% of the deaths that happened in Baltimore happened right there.
Really?
Yeah, so
Drug-related?
mostly, yes.
Pastor DeWitt grew up on these streets and has seen them go from vibrant to desperate.
This is not regular activity. This is addiction at its best right here. And if you see some of the people, young people on walkers and canes, and they're bent over as a result of the methadone which they use to try to get off the drugs.
So you've got the police here, what are they doing?
They're going to make sure that this park stays clear.
Does a police presence like that have an impact?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Is there enough of it?
No.
He hates the crime and anguish that he sees, so has dedicated his life to changing it.
We transformed this whole intersection from a crime-ridden area to an oasis of safety and inclusion. And on this vacant lot, we're building a performing arts center called the Sinai Center.
Pastor DeWitt wants to show us the bright spots, the ideas that can take root and change lives.
Here we're putting a little golf green here. Me and Elder Harris founded this farm.
His church has also opened an organic farm, which sells produce in local farmers markets, grown by people who've just got out of prison.
So the church has a massive impact, right, on this community.
Yeah. So if we could get this government to see us as not occasional or a footnote partner, but a solid, real partner in change, man, the impact that we could have.
There's no shortage of people willing to do the work to make things better. Crystal Parker is just one of Pastor DeWitt's partners in action. She knows how hard life can be here.
The biggest fear is someone coming through the community and just shooting up the whole block, and innocent people being caught in the crossfire.
So it's living in a state of stress.
It's living in a state of stress. It's living in a state of stress where you're enduring trauma because your neighbors who have endured trauma and their trauma has not been addressed are doing things that they feel they need to do to survive. And indeed, it's exacerbating the trauma because it has become a stance of normalcy.
And do those people you're speaking to have any faith in government, be it Republican or Democrat?
Absolutely not.
You deal with things very much on a grassroots level. What do you need from national leadership?
It is very important that we have people on the national level who has an ear and has compassion for and understand what the people in these communities are dealing with and going through.
And from what you're seeing from the two candidates so far, who has that?
I would say Kamala Harris has that, having been a prosecutor, having grown up in Oakland.
These blighted streets are an issue across America, and while election time brings lots of talk of hope and change, that still feels like a very long way off. So you heard there from residents of one neighborhood in Baltimore a fair amount of disillusionment about politicians and their willingness to help solve the problem of crime. Before we get into the politics, let's delve more into the data. Amy Fettig is Deputy Director of Fair and Just Prosecution, a non-profit working towards criminal justice reform. I started by asking her if, as Donald Trump says, crime is out of control.
The truth is that crime is not out of control in America. We did have a temporary spike in crime as a result of the global pandemic, which in some ways is very understandable. We had mass death, extreme isolation, chaos, economic dislocation, and that creates crime. So it's not surprising that we did have a spike. But right now in America, that spike has come way down, and we are pretty much back to the levels of crime that we had in 2019. Now, any crime is not great. Everybody deserves to live in safe, healthy, secure, and thriving communities, and we still have that goal in America to achieve.
So why has it come down? Is it simply the absence of the pandemic, or are there specific strategies that have worked?
In some ways, it's the absence of the pandemic. We've returned to the status quo. And in fact, crime has been falling in America since the 1990s. It's not yet where we want it to be. There's no question that public safety should and must remain a priority, but it is not out of control in America right now. That simply isn't true, and the numbers prove that to be the case.
So if crime is down, why is it still such an issue for voters?
Unfortunately, in America, since the 1970s, crime and criminal justice policy have been extremely politicized. And actually, that has been a deliberate strategy. Beginning in the 1970s, we now know that then President Nixon started what he called the war on drugs. It was actually a political campaign to disenfranchise the black vote and achieve greater popularity in the South, which was traditionally Democratic at that time. As a result, the war on drugs brought more and more people into our prisons and jails for very low level of offenses. And as a result of that policy and the subsequent changes to sentencing and policing that resulted, our incarcerated population grew a whopping 700% from the 1970s until today. And the reason is political. Because crime was used as a political strategy to fearmonger, to scare white suburbanites, and to be used as a coded way to indicate racial dog whistling. You cannot now separate criminal justice policy and discussions of crime and justice in America from the fact that we have a racialized system and that racial injustice, segregation, and discrimination remains a problem in America.
So with all of that in mind, how partisan would you say perceptions of crime are?
It's partisan to a degree, but unfortunately, both parties in America have used crime, the idea of being tough on crime, and basically fear-mongering with the population to gain votes.
If you do take the view that Republicans are tough on crime and Democrats essentially ignore it, which is a wide perception, certainly, will that be challenged in this election when you have this Kamala Harris, the former prosecutor, versus Donald Trump, the convicted felon? Do you think people will start to think differently?
The public has begun to understand that we can't incarcerate our way to public safety. We now have more people in prison and jail than any other country in the world. And quite frankly, it hasn't made us the safest country in the world at all. And the reason is because we have not invested in our social safety network. Crime is caused by poverty, a lack of housing, a lack of education, a lack of opportunity, a lack of access to health care, especially mental health care and substance use disorder treatment. Increasingly, the American public understands that. They understand that the past 50 years, where we spend literally almost $200 billion a year on criminal justice, that hasn't made us as safe as we need to be. So we need to start making different policy choices. And we're increasingly holding all of our political leaders, regardless of whether or not they're Republican or Democrat, accountable for that.
Which leads me to my next question. When you talk about crime as this umbrella term, can you really make comparisons between someone in a wealthy suburb who's worried about having their car stolen and a young girl who is worried about walking to school and not getting caught in crossfire?
That's a great point, because in America, crime is very concentrated. It is concentrated in certain neighborhoods. And these neighborhoods generally are characterized by extreme poverty and lack of opportunity. If we want to actually increase public safety, we would invest in those communities so that there would be housing and safe streets and access to education and opportunity. But we fail to do that. Instead, we build prisons and jails, which don't make us safer.
So those kinds of neighborhoods you're talking about, is there really any hope regardless of who gets in? Because those neighborhoods have been like that for a long time and governments have come and gone. So what is the solution there? Is there hope?
The solution is for all of us as a country to recognize that we have different options. Because although crime is concentrated in certain neighborhoods, by and large in America, we all feel the costs. As I mentioned before, $180 billion a year spent on our criminal justice system, when that money could go to housing, education, job opportunities, building stronger, healthier, more thriving communities. So our choice to try to incarcerate our way into public safety has deep impacts on all of us.
As we head into the election, from your expert view on this, what would you tell voters to be mindful of?
I would tell American voters to hold all of their political leaders accountable for investing in our communities, bringing us jobs, investing in accessible housing, increasing our education and our opportunities. We know that's what makes our communities safe. It's not more police and more people in prison. We've tried that, it doesn't work. It's time for real change in America.
Well, that was Amy Fettig, Deputy Director of Fair and Just Prosecution there, saying that much like immigration in our previous show, the notion of crime being wildly out of control just isn't backed up by the data. But here we are talking about it as a big election issue. To discuss the politics and politicization of crime is former Republican strategist and principal and founder of Relax Strategies, Rena Shah, and political strategist and former White House Clinton staffer, Orson Porter. Thank you both so much for joining us. So Rena, voters are saying that crime is a big concern, but the data suggests numbers are going down when it comes to violent crime. So how do you explain that disconnect?
Well, we're in a perception versus reality moment, and the FBI, our Federal Bureau of Investigations, is giving us data that shows actually the national crime rate is going down, and that includes violent crimes as well as property-related crimes. But what we have right now also is a drive up in public fear, and it's exacerbated by what I would call our mainstream media. Americans are getting their news from various sources now, but they're by and large going to places they trust and where they feel their narratives are reflected. So these political narratives that are shaped by various networks are also back shaping public opinion about what is reality. And again, it is a perception versus reality moment, because what we're finding in recent surveys is the data isn't correlating to attitudes. In this lead up to November, what a lot of people are looking for, though, is again looking at isolated incidents. And that's what campaigns tend to do. We've seen that from Republicans largely, particularly in July when they had the Republican National Convention and provided incidences, which were, again, isolated incidents of young people or various Americans being killed by illegal immigrants.
Right, and Donald Trump also has been talking in pretty lurid terms at some of his campaign rallies. How do Democrats deal with that? Because most of it's not based in fact, but how do you say he's wrong when he says this about crime without saying, and don't worry, crime's not an issue, it's not a big deal? How do the Democrats get that balance right?
I think that the best way is to have a response, and you have to keep in mind that we're only 10 weeks away from the election itself. We're about 30 days away from the early vote. So there are 43 states in the U.S. that have basically been told that you're not going to play in this election, unfortunately, and there are 7 states, battleground states, that matter. And in those battleground states, when you look at Georgia, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, crime is a major issue, and it has a lot to do with what you say. I'm from Wisconsin, and when I go home, crime is the leading story in the newspaper I pick up from the mailbox. Crime is on the morning news, the afternoon news, and the evening news, and even sometimes in the breaking news. But the issue of crime in these communities aren't necessarily solely focused on homicides or murders or robberies. Crime in these battleground states are being discussed through the lens of the fentanyl crisis that has no borders, through the lens of retail theft, when you have people coming in, stealing stuff, causing retail prices to increase, through the lens of immigration, and some of these incidents you've seen, retail theft, et cetera, et cetera. So when I was running campaign, violent crime was always the issue of the murder rate, the homicide rate. In this election cycle, and Democrats and Republicans would be smart to talk about crime not through the normal discussion topics, but through the kitchen table issues, like higher food prices is a direct cause of retail crime, like the immigration crisis is a direct cause to some of the incidents we've seen. So Republicans and Democrats, anyone running for elected office has to discuss crime. It's not the number one polling issue in the U.S., but it certainly is the second or third most discussed topic at kitchen tables around the country.
And it's at the heart of this campaign as well, Rena, because you've got the Democrats pitching Kamala Harris, the former prosecutor, up against Donald Trump, the convicted felon. This has been going for a bit now. We've had a couple of weeks of seeing this strategy in action. Do you think it's working?
I'm not really quite sure, because, again, we have differing opinions on what is most important to various Americans. Regardless of where you're looking, whether you're looking in the Midwest or a place where I'm from, which is rural West Virginia, landlocked and not anywhere near the southern border of the United States, you do tend to get people talking about public safety as it relates to the economy, as it relates to immigration. And when you talk about how that is shaping attitudes right now, it is tough to break through and say, well, this is this candidate who's rife with legal problems of his own. The Republican nominee, Donald Trump, the former president, is who I'm talking about. There have been many political strategists who believe that he has a challenge in maintaining his own credibility when he's got this many legal challenges, or excuse me, outcomes of legal cases that have made him a convicted criminal, a convicted felon. But again, I'm not seeing that breakthrough in the noise in the Democrat messaging that's been super successful, but it's still early in many ways. You know, Kamala Harris just got the baton a few weeks ago. She just named her running mate, what, 2 weeks ago? And they've just come off of a very successful convention that looks like they are starting to change some hearts and minds. But crime was a definitive issue in this past fall's Republican primary. I'm just not seeing it, despite, again, the prosecutor versus the convicted felon this time around.
Orson, given racism within law enforcement, is this pushing of Kamala Harris, the prosecutor, a good move?
Yes. African Americans want safe communities like every other constituency. They just want justice without any prejudice. And I think Harris is smart in that she's being very thoughtful in how she's going to roll out her policy. But I think it's often a misread by both sides that African Americans don't want safe communities. They do. And Harris, if you look at the polls, even though she was close to law enforcement officials in California when she was the AG, et cetera, she's never really been down with African American, I should say, lack of African American support. She's always had strong support. And you look at most candidates who African American support, who have tough stance on law enforcement. A lot of African American sheriffs often become mayors and or governors because they want safe communities. So I think it's often a misread to think that you don't want a law and order kind of candidate. What you do is want justice without prejudice, and I think she's smart to kind of roll that out slowly as she moves forward in this election.
And Rena, do you think now to have this return to being tough on crime, we look back to 2020 when Harris was running previously unsuccessfully, we had George Floyd, there were a lot of very hot issues at the time. Do you think now is the time to start saying, let's be tough on crime again? Is that a message that people are open to?
I think people are open to that message, actually, because right now what you're seeing from the Republican side is this desire to capitalize on public fears and dissatisfaction about public safety in their own communities, whether rural or urban. Is this going to be tied to violent crime? Is it going to be tied to immigration and the issue of illicit drugs pouring across our border? It differs from community to community. But I will say this, there is the one thing I've been really worried about in this election is misinformation and disinformation. And what I've seen from many a Republican candidate down ballot from the presidency, I would say, is this sense that they can win with the promoting and promulgating information that simply false about Kamala Harris's prosecutorial record. You know, they tend to talk less about the good things she's done, which is eliminating cash bail and advocating for more mental health services expansion to whether inmates or those who've been previously incarcerated. She's also supported a great number of crime prevention programs. But what she's had to do, and she's had to do this her entire time as VP as well, is push back on this misinformation about her prosecutorial record, particularly that aimed at Black communities in the state of California. I think she's still going to have that challenge in the next 6 to 8 weeks. How does she push back on that? I don't know, because Republicans, like I said, continue to hope and win on that message of crime is everywhere around you, and Democrats aren't helping you.
Yeah, Democrats are weak on crime seems to be the thing that they're really pushing. So how do the Democrats escape that? Aside from the prosecutor thing, which can only go so far, what do they need to be saying to voters about their approach to crime?
That they hear their concerns and that they have a plan. And then to go back to what I said earlier, to link it to other issues, to link, if you want to fight high retail prices at the grocery store, then we have to find a way to address retail theft. If you want to talk about cyber crimes, then we have to attack the issue working with law enforcement, but find unique ways to bring in a different kind of coalition that maybe people who haven't had an opinion on the crime discussion to say, yes, that fentanyl discussion affects me, that retail theft discussion affects me, the immigration, I never thought of it through a crime lens. But Democrats always should know that press drives policy, and as long as this is at the forefront of the nightly news, then it's going to be a major issue in this campaign.
Why isn't it more of an issue that a convicted felon is running to be president?
Because for Democrats, they're motivated by the candidate. And there's nothing that Trump has done in the past,
Republicans.
yeah, or will do in the future that will send Democrats to the polls more than they already have pledged. So I think, you know, the Harris campaign is smart in that they're talking about the issues. You're smart in that we're focusing in on crime, the issue. But Trump, the politician, is not a motivator for Democrats to be talking about his felony convictions, because his supporters have completely brushed that aside.
Okay. Orson, Rena, thank you both so much for joining us. Plenty to talk about going into the future. Thank you to Rena Shah and Orson Porter. That's all we have time for today. It's hard to believe that we have just 2 full months of campaigning to go now. Expect to hear a lot more about crime in the coming weeks as both parties enter the sprint to the White House. Join us next time for all you need to know on Inside America.